Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to Asylums Uncovered, where we discuss the influence and impact of state hospitals on American history and the void left in their absence. This episode's going to be a little different than the previous ones. We're going to focus more on the void of state hospitals and their absence. How does the criminal justice system handle mental illness? Admittedly, I had no idea how the court system was set up to handle these cases, but after hearing the story of Tristin Murphy, I wanted to dig deeper and discuss this incredibly important topic. Tristin was a 37-year-old from Florida, clinically diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, who tragically ended his life in prison with a chainsaw in September of 2021. While incarcerated for a littering charge, Tristin was not provided any mental health treatment and not given his medication for a week prior to his death. Instead, he was put in solitary confinement, alone with his own thoughts and voices in his head, which is arguably the worst environment he could have been in. A paranoid schizophrenic, off his meds, alone in an isolation cell. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, and initially there's a couple things that raise questions. How does a clinically diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic have access to a chainsaw? And how or why was he not provided treatment or medication? What exactly happened with this case to end up the way it did? Trust me, we will get there, and I'm going to take a chronological approach to truly illustrate how this all unfolded. This case is perhaps one of the most heartbreaking, saddest situations I have ever seen. And the worst part was that it was completely avoidable. I first heard about this story after watching a CBS Miami documentary released in October 2023 that takes a deep dive into this case. I will post the link to that below, and I highly recommend you check it out. It's about an hour long and definitely worth the watch. Although the story of Tristin Murphy is modern day, it's very reminiscent of times at the beginning of the 19th century when jails had no separation of the mentally ill and violent criminals. People like Tristin were provided no treatment and hidden away only to be forgotten. In the very first episode of this podcast, I talked about trailblazer Dorothea Dix seeing these abysmal conditions in prisons at this time and pushing for reform. In fact, today, prisons are seen as the new asylums. According to NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, 2 in 5 people who are incarcerated have a history of mental illness, a rate higher than the national average of only 1 in 5. About 3 in 5 people with a history of mental illness do not receive any treatment while incarcerated in a state or federal facility. And more than 50% of people who were taking medications for a mental illness upon admission did not continue to receive those medications once actually in the jail. And it is a fact that mentally ill inmates have a higher rate of taking their own lives. Born April 11th, 1984, Tristin was a bright student, particularly in math. He began to struggle around the 8th grade, so his parents had him tested for a learning disorder. It was determined that he had a visual motor integration issue. Visual motor integration is what some may call hand-eye coordination. It's perceiving visual information, processing it, and responding accordingly. Examples of this are coloring inside the lines or catching a ball. Tristin dropped out of high school and started working jobs like landscaping. He did fall into some drug use and had a few minor run-ins with the law. He did go on to get married and have 2 sons, and by all accounts, he was an attentive, doting father. According to Tristin's parents, they noticed a significant change with him in 2017. He was saying odd things like there were listening devices in his house and that he was under surveillance, so clearly they knew something mentally was going on. Tristin didn't want to see a doctor because he didn't have health insurance, and we all know how expensive that can be. Seeing a psychiatrist with health insurance is expensive. This all kind of escalated early 2018. Tristin's mental health was deteriorating with the paranoia and delusions. Child Protective Services got involved and removed Tristin's kids from his home, placing them with his parents. He could only see his kids through prearranged supervised visits through the state. This understandably was very upsetting, so one day Tristin shows up unannounced to his parents' house, gets in some kind of physical altercation with his dad, and the police show up. His parents try to explain to the cops, look, something mentally is going on with him, and his dad's not even mad or upset. Clearly, he knows something psychologically is off, and how they describe the next sequence of events is the cops have Tristin face down in a bed of rocks, tasing him, and a deputy is on his back. In the police report, deputies claim that Tristin was swinging on them and cursing at them, and one deputy even reports that Tristin bit him, so they had to use physical force to get him under control. I'm hoping we can all agree that a mentally ill person shouldn't be treated like this. But let's take a step back for a second. Police respond to a call that they think is some kind of domestic violence situation involving a younger guy hitting his dad, and that's really all they know. Then upon their arrival, Tristin starts swinging on them, biting one of them, to which they have no way of knowing this is a psychotic episode because they may not have received specialized training to identify it as such. In the documentary, Pinellas County Sheriff Bob Gualtieri explains that in the police academy, they get little to no training on mental health. Some agencies do provide crisis intervention team training, a 40-hour course, which can help identify a mental health situation, but without being able to diagnose what it is, it can be very difficult to determine how to address it. Because let's be honest, in the heat of the moment, is it easy to differentiate between a psychotic episode and someone who's on drugs? Or how can you differentiate? If anyone out there has personal law enforcement experience, I'd be curious to know what training your agency provides or what insight you might have on this. With domestic violence situations, cops don't have much wiggle room when it comes to arrests, so this resulted in Tristin being charged with numerous felonies and booked into the Charlotte County Jail, where his mental health spiraled. And at this point, it makes me wonder, instead of being arrested, could Tristin have been Baker Acted? The Baker Act is a Florida law that allows families, law enforcement, and healthcare providers to pursue emergency mental health services if someone is displaying signs of mental illness who might be a danger to themselves or others. A person is placed on a 72-hour hold and undergoes an involuntary mental health examination. While in jail, Tristin's paranoia and delusions grew increasingly worse. Anytime his parents spoke with him, he was talking nonsense that they just could not make any sense of. So after 5 months of sitting in the jail, Tristin is finally seen by a psychiatrist who determines he is suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and the judge finds him incompetent. And from what I could find, this was the first time Tristin received an official clinical diagnosis, and I have not been able to confirm if he was prescribed medication at the time of diagnosis. Traditionally, in the state of Florida, if a judge finds you incompetent, you're sent to one of 6 state hospitals for what is called competency restoration. And this was the process for where Tristin was in Charlotte County. The process of being found incompetent by a judge can differ state to state and even between counties. And one would think that competency restoration would mean both making the person competent to stand trial and to treat the mental illness. But in reality, the system is not set up to provide mental health treatment. According to Miami-Dade County Judge Steve Leifman, who is interviewed in the documentary, he says the competency restoration program is the biggest waste of taxpayer money, does nothing to actually help the person, and keeps them in this revolving door within the system. What he explains is through these programs, a person basically goes through some classes to understand how to do a plea deal, and treatment is not part of that. He also says they found that 70% of the people who go through these programs end up getting their charges dropped, get credit for time served, or they get probation. So they leave the courthouse after they make their plea with zero access to treatment. Thus it being this revolving door, the mental illness isn't being treated, they get arrested again, and the cycle just repeats itself. From what I could find, the first documented time Tristin is given any medication for his psychosis is in the psychiatric hospital. And from what his parents describe when they went to visit him around Christmas of 2018, was that he was not doing well physically or mentally. He had lost a lot of weight and just kind of sat there just staring into the distance. It doesn't seem that the medication or his time in the hospital was positive. At the start of the new year 2019, the hospital tells the court that Tristin is now competent to stand trial, and he goes back to jail. About a month later, he goes in front of a judge, pleads no contest, and gets credit for time served and placed on probation. Again, no treatment for his mental illness at all. The hospital got him quote-unquote competent enough for his plea deal, and that was that. So the question then becomes, why is there no required medication or treatment plan as part of probation? The thinking is, if we're going to put people with mental illness on probation, there needs to be parameters to ensure they're receiving the treatment or the medications they need, and currently probation officers are not equipped to handle these types of cases. A typical probation officer checks in on the standard things like, are you passing your drug test? Are you looking for a job? So what Judge Leifman suggests is specialized probation officers for these cases that know the mental health system and can help people access treatment. Judge Leifman actually created a program in Miami-Dade County known as the Criminal Mental Health Project that diverts mentally ill individuals away from the criminal justice system and into treatment. And I do want to note that this program is for offenders with misdemeanors and less serious felonies. Instead of punishing them, the focus is providing rehabilitation, support, and integration back into the community. In addition, this program focuses on crisis intervention team training for police so they can identify a mental health situation and de-escalate. A screening process was also created to detect any signs and symptoms of mental illness when a defendant is being booked into the jail. If something is detected, they are referred to the corrections psychiatric staff for a more thorough evaluation. And this model has pretty impressive results. Recidivism rates for misdemeanor offenders decreased from about 75 to 20% annually, and those with felonies had a significant reduction by almost 75% in the number of jail bookings and days spent in jail. If Tristin had been arrested in Miami-Dade County, his path would have been much different and he would have received the treatment he needed. Miami-Dade looks at the long-term treatment plan versus the system in Charlotte County that's just this revolving door of the criminal justice system and competency restoration. So going back to Tristin, in October 2019, he started having paranoia, delusions, and hearing voices again. In December of that year, he drove to the jail, got out of his truck, and rolled his truck into a pond. And the deputy that arrived on scene admits that he knew who Tristin was since he was a prior inmate. They arrest and charge Tristin with littering more than 500 pounds, which in the state of Florida is a third-degree felony. And Tristin's parents think that this was a cry for help because who in their right mind would drive their truck into a pond outside of the jail where everyone can see? It makes zero sense. And this leaves me personally wondering if responding officers had the history of his mental health, would they have possibly viewed it that way as well? Since he committed a felony while on probation, Tristin is sent to jail where he sits for 576 days, yet again in solitary confinement. And at this point, his schizophrenia hits its peak. In the documentary, the phone conversations between Tristin and his mom are heartbreaking.
They're talking through your head right now and saying all that?
Does that sound like me, Mom? Cindy, Sue Murphy, Esquire. This is us in the United States Navy. Your son has an outlaw chip. We were talking out mouth. We gave him a special scan from the United States Navy. Son made the president of the United States of America, just like Bill Clinton.
Can I talk to you, Tristin?
Yeah.
Where are you at? Are you in your cell?
I'm in my cell, by myself. I have a special scan, and they're talking
Okay.
out my mouth.
Has anybody checked on you? Is there anybody, guards or anybody around you that's listening to what's going on?
Also on these calls, Tristin is basically asking his mom to help him die. I mean, aren't jail calls monitored? No alarms are going off to anyone listening to these calls. I'm sure if any of us heard someone speaking like this, it would absolutely warrant some questions. I mean, people on jail calls get in trouble for smuggling in contraband, cell phones, things like that. So to me, it doesn't make any sense that listening to this, you would not set off some alarm bells and say, hey, this guy is really sick and he needs some serious, serious help. In September 2020, Tristin goes in front of a judge for his littering charge and again is declared incompetent. So just to put this into perspective, this is now the second time he's been declared incompetent by a judge. The first time was that domestic situation with his dad and the cops, and now this time for the littering charge. So remember that revolving door I mentioned earlier? Well, now you're starting to see it. And this further solidifies that the competency restoration program is not the same as treatment. In the judge's order, he actually notes that Tristin will most likely cause bodily harm against himself or to others. But instead of at least sending him immediately to a state hospital, he sits in solitary confinement for another 6 months. And as I'm sure you can imagine, Tristin's mental health deteriorated. In February of 2021, he started refusing to take his meds, he stopped eating, and was just growing increasingly agitated. He was taken to see a psychiatrist, but the doctor wasn't provided any of his mental health records, so they had no idea of his previous diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. And this is all too common. Every piece of the system working in silos instead of working together. So the doctor diagnoses Tristin with antisocial personality disorder, not a psychosis. So in other words, they did not confirm that he had paranoid schizophrenia. And this is just another example of the difficulty of mental illness as a whole and the difficulty of how it may be presenting to one doctor versus another. So Tristin is sent back to jail, yet again put in solitary confinement while he waits to go to the state hospital. In March of 2021, 171 days after the judge declared him incompetent for the second time, he's finally sent to the state hospital for competency restoration. Almost 6 months later, he's finally going to a state hospital. This is far too long to pass by, and unfortunately, this is the norm. During the time that Tristin was waiting to go to the hospital, he was only one of 640 inmates sitting in county jails across Florida waiting for a bed to open at the state hospital. By law, DCF, the Department of Children and Families, has 15 days to hospitalize an inmate when a judge orders them to a state hospital. At the start of COVID in March 2020, DCF announced it would be halting transfers temporarily until new cleaning and quarantine protocols were put in place. But due to this halt, a huge backlog occurred, and the patients are the ones that end up suffering from this. And this isn't an issue special to Florida. This is actually a crisis all over the country. Mentally ill people who have been declared incompetent by a judge are sitting in jail, arguably the worst environment for them, because state hospitals don't have the space. The hospital declared Tristin competent to stand trial in April 2021, and he's taken back to jail. This is exactly what happened last time. He got sent to the hospital for competency restoration. They eventually say he's competent to stand trial. He goes back to jail, goes in front of a judge, makes a plea. It is wash, rinse, repeat. Except this time, he pleads no contest, and instead of getting credit for time served and probation, he gets sentenced to 3 years in prison. July 15th, 2021, Tristin is transferred to the state prison to start his 3-year sentence. During intake at any prison in the state of Florida, inmates are given what is called an S grade, which is the mental health grade. Tristin was given the grade of S3, which says he has a diagnosed mental health disorder and requires medication, even if the inmate is refusing that medication. Also on his intake forms, the prison notes that Tristin suffers from paranoia, psychosis, and delusions. So they are well aware that he has a clinically diagnosed mental illness and needs medication. There is no disputing whether the prison knew or didn't know that he was suffering from mental illness. He's in the prison, and for 8 days, he is not given his medication, and his schizophrenia was full blown, and he is talking to himself and invisible people. Then he starts receiving his meds again, but then stops after he's transferred to a different area of the prison. And this is all documented in prison records. Prisoners can't even be given an ibuprofen or an Advil without it being documented. With his transfer to the South Unit, the paperwork indicated that Tristin was not on any medication, which is not only incorrect, but a fatal error. Even if you're transferred to a different unit within the prison, your S grade stays with you. Realistically, there's no reason why that should have been marked no, that he was not on any medication, but for some reason it was. According to prison records, the last day Tristin received his medication was September 11th, 2021, And 5 days later, on September 16th, Tristin took his life. When interviewed by law enforcement, many of the inmates that day said they thought something was wrong with Tristin, that he was talking to himself and just acting really weird. And one even said, he's a paranoid schizophrenic. It's like the inmates recognize things way better than any of the staff. His psychosis was so glaring that the other inmates were even avoiding him. That day, about 30 inmates, including Tristin, went on a landscaping work detail. So again, the inmates clearly seeing something was wrong with Tristin and saying he was mentally ill. How did the staff not see it? And why was he given access to a chainsaw if his behavior was so blatant? The supervisor that day asked a few of the inmates if they knew how to start a chainsaw for tree trimming. Tristin volunteered, and once the supervisor asked him to put it down, he held it to his neck and he eventually bled out. This whole story is just, it is so heartbreaking. It is so just, it's infuriating, it's heartbreaking, it's sad, and it's pretty unbelievable how the system failed Tristin. Perhaps even more enraging are the actions of a prison supervisor on police body cam right after this happened. First, he's seen kind of laughing about it and says, "Oh, this is the first time I've seen this." He chopped his head off, just really nonchalantly. Then he tries to tell the cops that Tristin is probably depressed and he's probably missing his girlfriend. I mean, the audacity. It is a complete disregard for human life and your duty to keep those under your supervision safe. But unfortunately, this is an accurate representation of how mental health is addressed within the prison system. And also, it is so insulting to those who are dealing with depression and have ended their lives or who have thought about ending their lives. If you watch the documentary, you will know exactly who I'm talking about. The Florida Department of Corrections Inspector General did an investigation, and it was determined that no administrative violations occurred, although internal prison staff emails confirm that Tristin should have been seen by a psychiatrist within 2 weeks of arriving to the prison, but wasn't because of staff shortages. These emails also stated that mental health is not taken into consideration when determining work detail, so that's how Tristin was able to gain access to the chainsaw. I mean, this case is just fail after fail after fail. And I just want to say my heart and sincere condolences go out to Tristin's parents. Watching them talk about this in the documentary, it's awful. It is gut-wrenching. It's horrible. I mean, they knew that Tristin needed help. They couldn't do anything for him because you can't set up appointments for your adult child to see a psychiatrist. He's in the prison system because of a cry for help, and this is what happens. I mean, it's awful. So where do we as a society go from here, and what does the criminal justice system need to change when dealing with mental illness? Judge Leifman, so let me just say, Judge Leifman, like, my hat is off to you, sir, because you have not only incorporated such a revolutionary, awesome process in Miami-Dade County, but he also travels all across the country to help other states adopt that same system that he created. It's just, he's like out there doing it. He is out there advocating for people with mental illness and trying to change things for the better. In 2021, the Florida legislature did create a commission to look at current methods of providing mental health services in the state, evaluate those methods, and make changes as needed. Part of this is providing police officers with that crisis intervention team training to learn how to recognize mental illness and de-escalate the situation. Recognizing mental illness much earlier in the process may help prevent this revolving door in and out of the court system and actually help people get the treatment they need. In January of 2023, the commission recommended to the Florida legislature to create mental health courts across the state, like the one in Miami, but the legislature failed to act on this recommendation, and they have increased the funding for competency restoration, since that seems to be working so well. I do think it's important to remember this tragedy wasn't just the result of lack of mental health care within the prison system. I actually don't think it's fair to 100% blame the prison system, but more so a problem rooted in the lack of availability and affordability of mental health care as a whole. All right, guys, that's it for me today. Thank y'all so much for listening, and until next time.